Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Gini Dietrich.
Now I'm thinking that you just deliberately wait just to kind of get under my skin.
I did that time. Last week I did not, but that time I did.
It's feeling like deliberate sabotage now, Gini, and I don't know that I'm okay with that.
This time it was. Last week, the first week, I don't know what the deal was. Last week I definitely was not on purpose, but this one, that was on purpose. You're welcome.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I mean, we don't have enough problems doing this show, so we really ought to, create new issues proactively just for fun.
Why not?
Well,
it's 2020.
So I guess the question for our listeners is: was that pause too long, too short, or just right? Nothing?
Nothing. Right.
Just right. Just right. Excellent. Right. Excellent. So, and that is indeed a segue into today's show, because I thought we would actually get into it rather than, taking 2 minutes of banter time today. Trying to be efficient with your time and ours. So,
okay. All right.
So we're going to talk about the Goldilocks Principle when it comes to dealing with prospective clients. And we're going to look at it in a different way than you typically do, because oftentimes people talk about Goldilocks pricing, where you have 3 different options that you provide to a prospect: one low, one high, and one just right. And the whole idea is that you steer them towards that middle option, that the preferred option that you would like them to take, maybe get them to spend a little more money, take on a little bit more work, kind of just really right size it for you. But I also think that there's another way to look at the Goldilocks Principle when it comes to prospects, and that's what we're going to talk about this week. And that is that you should be looking for clients for whom the amount that they're spending with you is just right. So not just from the pricing standpoint, but if they're coming to you, they can comfortably afford to buy your services, but it's not so insubstantial to them that your agency's work just doesn't matter. And so I think this is something that often gets overlooked, and there are some pitfalls for agencies that aren't thinking this way, particularly when they're looking at ideal clients.
It's interesting. I'm a big proponent of the low, medium, and high, just from a psychology perspective, pricing, because clients typically, humans, not just clients, human beings in general, typically try to go for, they don't want to be seen too cheap, and maybe they don't want the expensive end. So you put the one in the middle that is really what they should be doing and the kinds of work you should be doing, that where your strengths lie is that piece, because that's just from a human psychology perspective, that's where they go. But I hadn't really considered it from the client perspective, just in terms of, you raise a good point, because I have a client who had a client until 2 weeks ago that they were priced way too low, and the agency services were priced way too low, and they were doing all sorts of great work, but because the client didn't have that much skin in the game, that they didn't value the work. And this is, I think, a really interesting perspective when you think about how much skin the client has in the game, so that they actually take it seriously and look at it as an investment, because they do have to spend their time and resources as well to make it successful.
Yeah, and we've talked previously about how, agencies and clients are not truly partners, even though, you always love to use that language.
Right.
But there is a partnership element in sharing some of the risk and reward of the relationship. And I think that's where it comes in, because, as you put it, skin in the game. If the amount is so inconsequential that they don't really feel like they have skin in the game, they're not going to be responsive to you. They're not going to give you the tools and information that you need in order to do your job well. If you look at, if you were to talk to them and they said, well, yes, this is 17th on my priority list for your regular contact. Well, then, what are the odds that your engagement's going to be successful? It's pretty low. but it also rears its head at the lower end of the spectrum, where someone's pinching pennies, scrounging together every little bit they can in order to afford to hire your agency. And I see this particularly with startup agencies who tend to skew towards trying to find, the smaller clients, right? That's just because there's a natural instinct. Well, the smaller client is easier to get, and
right. They need my help,
right? And I need a track record before I can go for the Walmarts of the world, and blah blah blah, all those kinds of things. And that's rubbish. We've talked about that on other episodes. We'll talk about it again, I'm sure. But the problem you have if it's a huge investment for their business, their organization to hire you, then they're likely to be a difficult client, first of all, because those pennies mean far more to them than for your other clients. Those tend to be the clients that tend to be micromanagers. They tend to be the ones looking for almost immediate results. And at the end of the day, it's very difficult to produce results for clients like that because you spend so much time looking over your own shoulder that you're not able to get your work done. And so I think both ends of the spectrum have some real risk to them.
It's interesting you say that because I have found that on both ends of the spectrum where they're not spending that much money, but the budget is a Datsun and they want the Porsche services. And they micromanage and they're squeaky wheels. And then you see that on the other end of the spectrum too, like what you just described. So if you can figure out what that middle piece is, where they have just enough investment or skin in the game and can give and treat you like a true, I know you don't like partner, but a true valuable asset to the business, to their business, that's where you're going to find the real success.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important for agencies to clearly define who their ideal clients are.
Sure.
Because that's where you don't get yourself into trouble. That's where you're in a position where you know exactly who you're looking for and, importantly, who you're not looking for. And so you can very easily weed out a lot of the bad Goldilocks clients by by specifying size or revenue or number of employees or life cycle stage or whatever. There's a lot of different ways, and it's not going to be the same for every industry. It sort of depends on what your actual specialties are. But there's a lot of things that you can do so that at a glance, you can tell whether this is more likely than not to be someone who is falling at one end of the spectrum.
And I like that you call it the Goldilocks philosophy, because I think that's really interesting. I mean, just write down the word Goldilocks, stick it on a Post-it note and put it on your computer. And that will remind you every time you have a conversation to remember that it's not too little, it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right.
Yeah, and I think I am one of those people. I like to come up with acronyms or analogies or those kinds of things because I think it helps people remember the principles more, and it does make it easier for you to sort of just to sit there and say to yourself, you're having a conversation with a prospect and say, Goldilocks Principle, right? And so I think it does improve the recall. It's completely unscientific. I am not a researcher. I don't have a PhD, blah, blah, blah. But I do think it's helpful. And I think that the other thing that this can be helpful with is it gives you the ability to hold more firm on your pricing as well. Because you can run into a lot of problems if you are adjusting your pricing dramatically for individual clients. It generally happens at the lower end, where you try to do everything you can to find something so that that client can afford to use you. And so you sit there and you're like, okay, well, if I take this out and I take that out, I can get this in so that it's just above where they can afford it. And so that sounds good, it feels good, maybe even closes the business, but then you're in a position where you've just barely crept in within the budget of the prospect, and that is not helpful. And we now have an additional guest on the show for those of you who are in audio land.
I just looked over and there was a hamster on my shoulder, which I was not expecting.
Nobody really, I think, is ever expecting to have a hamster on their shoulder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's not just
totally.
Right. That is
not just right.
It is too hot, too cold, and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
It's really hard to be taken seriously when this stuff happens. So,
right.
you know.
But so having those pricing parameters, helps you not just at the low end, also helps you at the high end too, because there's also the tendency, if all of a sudden you're in talks with a client that's much bigger than anyone you've ever dealt with before, and so you start figuring out, okay, well, how can I price it higher? Because I know they've got the deep pockets, but that higher price may still be inconsequential to them. If you've dealt primarily with SMEs, and all of a sudden, you're dealing with, a Walmart or an Exxon or something like that, their budgets are wildly different. And so what seems big to your normal clients is going to be a drop in the bucket for those guys. And so, you want to be careful that you're not, adjusting your pricing in there. So this is where you need to have a set idea for what your prices are. And it's why I love being transparent with prospects, because it allows them to make their own Goldilocks determination before they're even wasting your time with detailed conversations.
Right. I totally agree with that. And I would also add to that especially if you're accustomed to working with SMEs, and then you start to build your agency and you start to work with larger clients, you may think, oh my gosh, I'm accustomed to being paid $5,000 a month or $3,000 a month, and now I'm going to make $20,000 a month, which for you, that's huge. But for these larger clients, when they have other agencies that are charging that are going to charge $50,000 or $60,000 a month, they wonder what's wrong with you. Well, what's wrong with these guys? Why are they so much cheaper? And so there's that psychology piece of it too, which we keep coming back to the psychology piece of it, but you have to really understand buying patterns and how human beings make decisions as you're going into a different type of prospect.
Right. And I think we've also, we've talked about the importance in the past of understanding what the right size projects for your agency to work on anyway are, right? Because if they're too small, you're not interested, right? So if you've got a really low dollar client as compared to all your others, the chances are they're not getting your brain power in the same way, and they will always lose out when there is a larger client asking you to do something at the same time. So it tends to lead to bad things. At the same time, when you overreach and you promise that you can do these giant projects that you've never undertaken before, you may not be staffed effectively for it. You may not have the tools and the resources that you need to do it easily. So you may be, building the scaffolding around you as you're servicing the clients, which at some point when you're an agency and you're looking to grow, that happens, but you don't want to be doing that on a regular basis, because that's where you start to run into problems. And you have to do it consciously. You have to know, I'm going to be building the scaffolding, and so maybe I adjust the client's expectations going in.
It's interesting. I actually just had a conversation that was similar to this with a client, and he said, I feel like in some cases you've reduced your fee. And I said, I have. And the reason that I've done that is because what we're doing with this particular client is we're building the scaffolding that I can use then again and again and again with other clients.
Right.
So while I still have to do the work specific to them, I am building a process that can be replicated. And so he and I had the conversation that I'm charging not a lot less, but a little bit less, because I'm going to be able to replicate that and use it over and over and over again. And he was like, that's awesome, because he feels like he's getting something that's totally customized to his business, and he's not paying as much as he would if he were the second or third in line.
Right. And I think that's where transparency is really helpful, because you've helped adjust the expectations, and if there's trouble with that scaffolding, to sort of continue to torture that analogy, things aren't going to fall off. You can still figure out how to to continue moving forward. So absolutely. So I think it's important, and I'm a fan of strategically using pricing in those ways. So, I don't like discounts generally, as we've talked about before. You always need to be reducing service, or, as we also say, get some other kind of value. In your case, it's the learnings to build the process to make this something that you can scale out to others, and get the learnings that you need to do it effectively. I do the same thing with the agency business checkup that I do with clients. I tend to underprice that, because that's most of those clients become coaching clients, and frankly, I want them to take that option because it makes the coaching experience better, which means they're going to get more out of it, which means they're going to stay longer with me. So I'm increasing the lifetime value. So I'm willing to take a little bit of a hit on my margin on that upfront project, because it's giving me the foundation of knowledge that will help me build a better coaching relationship over time. And so I think as long as you're using these things strategically and you understand what trade-offs you're making and why it pays off for you at the end of the day, you can do that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I know some other agency owners that will charge for a project, let's just, a strategy session or a workshop or whatever it happens to be at the beginning, and then they'll deduct that cost if the client becomes a longer term client, or they sign a 12 or 18-month contract or whatever happens to be. So I think there's some real value in that kind of strategic pricing for sure.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of creative options, and I think, ultimately the key is as we talked about earlier, is just to make sure that they're the right fit for
absolutely
the prospect first and foremost, but also your agency. And if you get it so that your porridge is just right and their porridge is just right, those are the kinds of ongoing relationships that will be filling and taste great.
Wow. On that note.
Yeah, I think we've tortured ourselves, we've tortured the analogies, and we certainly probably tortured you, the listener, quite enough at this point. So
and me, you've tortured me.
I had to look at a hamster for this episode, so
not the whole time.
No,
it's like 2 minutes.
Right. Well, I don't want to see a hamster at all. I don't like animals, any of them.
I know you don't like anything. You don't like people.
Well,
you like animals.
See, now you just make me sound this episode is over. I'm done with this. I'm done with you. I'm done with the listeners. This episode is over. I'm Chip Griffin.
I can't.
She's Ginny Dietrich, and it depends.